Welcome back to IRG Physical and Hand Therapy's Health Talk. I am Ron Schakal with the one and only Shannon O'Kelly. And our next guest is a part 3, Dr. Lisa Stubbs. She's a senior investigator at the Pacific Northwest Research Institute, Shannon. And she's had so much great information about the brain and stress that you had to have her back for another segment.
Yeah, because I had so many questions. This is fascinating stuff. I mean, Dr. Stubbs is studying the stress response, the environmental stress response, how it affects our brain and brain health. And it's quite fascinating, the stuff they're doing in medical research to identify how stress affects us and maybe your gene and your gene makeup.
Here's Shannon and Dr. Lisa Stubbs, part 3, about stress and the brain.
Dr. Lisa Stubbs, welcome back to Health Talk. Here we are, third time's the charm, right?
Yes, great to be back with you.
We're excited to have you back. We've had a couple conversations and we've been talking about your role in research and researching the effects of environment on genes, stress, a lot of interesting stuff going on at your research lab. But, we haven't really talked about your research lab or the institute that you work at, which is PNRI, Pacific Northwest Research Institute. I read a little bit about it when we first were starting to talk. Interesting concept, fascinating concept. Tell our listeners about your lab.
Okay. PNRI is a small not-for-profit research institute really focused on genetics, which makes it quite unusual in that the whole focus of the institute is genetics. And in particular, we're interested as a group in identifying genes that make you susceptible or, on the other hand, resilient to different kinds of environmental issues, like the one I'm going to talk about, stress, and how your genetics determine how you can handle or not handle particular kinds of environmental inputs. And we are really, really motivated to identify those genes that are deciding whether or not you are actually susceptible to particular kinds of environmental issues.
But as a researcher, what is the effect on your research? You mentioned nonprofit, and I'm just interested, when you're not connected to profitability or political influence from money investment, et cetera, are you unencumbered on your research? Does it make it, how do you feel as a researcher working in that type of environment?
Oh, well, it's actually very wonderful. We, like researchers everywhere, we are required to identify funding agencies, grant funding for our research, and so that means we've got to really justify ourselves, have our ducks in a row, have everything all organized. We also have some donor funding through PNRI, but mostly we operate on government grants, and we have to work hard to get those. That's the only constraint, really. You just have to have a really good idea and be able to justify why you're doing the work.
Okay, and you're doing this work. I think the work that you're currently doing, we've talked about, is this effect of stress, the environment, on your ability to your genes and your brain development, et cetera. So let's get caught up there a little bit and kind of bring everybody up to speed what you're doing again.
Okay. So we are really interested, my group is really interested in how your genes determine how your brain develops and how that affects how you respond to stressful circumstances in life. And that whole system of stress involves the brain and the body coordinated together and they talk to each other in an important way, so that stress feeds back to the brain and the brain feeds back to the body to get you cause whole body effects of stress. And we're really interested in the genetics of how people can respond to stress, adapt to stress, be susceptible to stress, or be resilient to stress, and how that affects your body and health.
Well, I always thought it was just if my parents, my mom and my dad, were resilient to stress and tolerated stress and it didn't affect them, naturally I was going to be resistant to stress. But now you're saying that I may inherit those genes, but are those genes potentially influenced by outside factors?
Yes, they are. First of all, you inherit genes, but you inherit genes from your mother and father in sort of an interesting, complicated way. So you don't have exactly the same genes as your mother and father. You might be susceptible to stress in ways that they are not. But in addition, your life experience is going to be different, and life experience certainly shapes the brain.
More with Dr. Lisa Stubbs and Shannon O'Kelly right after this on Como.
It's a Northwest Lifestyle Weekend on Como News. IRG's Health Talk continues.
Our conversation about stress and how it affects the brain with Dr. Lisa Stubbs and Shannon O'Kelly continues right now.
Hi there, everybody. Again, we're talking to Dr. Lisa Stubbs, and Dr. Lisa Stubbs has been talking about her research in genetics and how our genes can be affected by environmental influences, stress, etc., and how we react to that. And I just was saying that, we get our genes from our parents. Those genes come from our parents differently, but now you're telling me those genes can be influenced by outside factors, stress, and other things. Tell us about that.
Depending on how you're set up, your brain is set up, your sensitivities are set up, you're going to respond to life experiences in different ways. You're going to find some things stressful that I wouldn't find stressful, and other people are going to find things, totally fine that I would find terribly stressful. But whatever you do, whenever you perceive the stress, it's going to have an impact on your brain response, and that will be communicated to your body. And that's when the health effects can start. If that is not terminated, if we can all, a little bit of stress helps us all, just helps us cope. But if you don't learn to control it, it can really destroy your health.
And so, when you are stressed and experiencing stress, the natural tendency is this, what we call fight or flight reaction. And that stress is usually, if it's a fight situation, you've got this cortisol and everything being released, blood pressure, all this crazy inflammation probably in your body. It's just a natural response, but you don't want that all the time, right?
No, that's right. It's good for you for short term, helps you cope, helps you get away from the threat. But if it goes on too long, it can cause you damage.
And so what do you guys envision as you look at genes and identifying how genes react to stress and et cetera? Do you see yourself in the future being able to, if someone has a gene that just doesn't tolerate stress well, is there education? Is there outside environmental influences? You can change that, remodel it. What do you see?
Well, genes, it's never just one gene. Genes work together in big gangs, in big groups, and what we call networks and pathways. And you can have all of these genes in different versions of each other interacting with each other in different ways. And so that's what makes us all unique in terms of our response. But what you can do is, if you knew that you had a susceptible group of genes in an individual, you would be able to understand potentially why they respond certain ways to certain kinds of stressors. You might be able to say, this person is ultra sensitive to this kind of stress. And so you can figure out, when you know which genes they are, you know which part of the cycle of stress, whether it's brain or body, whether it's the fight or flight mechanism or something upstream in terms of how you perceive stress. It depends on where your susceptibility is, your groups of genes that are susceptible are, to decide what kind of therapies or what kind of interventions might be best for you.
Have you found, or are you anticipating that these genes are influenced differently during different growth cycles of development, human development? Yeah,
absolutely. The way your brain develops sets the stage for your susceptibility, for sure, and that's all dependent on your genetics. It gets remodeled later by your experience is a different story, but you're born with a certain kind of propensity to be overreactive or to be less reactive to certain kinds of stress.
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff. Again, we're going to obviously talk again in the future. What you folks are doing in research is just incredible with genomes. We have to have you come back, but thank you for your time today.
Okay.
Great information from Dr. Lisa Stubbs. Wow.
Yeah, it could be a 3-week conference. It sounds like we definitely have to have her back. I've got more questions.
All right, that sounds good. We'll be back with more IRG Physical and Hand Therapies Health Talk right after this on Como.